Okay, hello, welcome. Having a little technical difficulty here. My name's Casey Roonan. I am obviously Casey Roonan, based on the title, the name of this YouTube account, the website above my head, and the Instagram handle. So that goes without saying. I am an illustrator and a cartoonist and a cartoon and illustration instructor. And so today I'm going to be just doing a little bit of ink drawing, finishing up this demo piece that I used in my class several weeks ago. And just finishing this up for you guys, trying to hopefully give you some tips and tricks about ink drawing. So obviously we're working essentially in the style of, a traditional comic book or, newspaper comic strip artist, using a brush and India ink. And part of this as well is that I am using non-photo blue pencil. I'd use that to do the preliminary underdrawing for this piece. So here, when I do these demos for my students in my class, I like to do some kind of fan art, because just to keep myself from getting sucked into too many things that are outside of the realm of, A, work that I'm getting paid for, or B, my own personal artwork. I try to limit myself to only doing fan art for these demos, for the most part, so that I'm not, sucking up valuable time. Not to denigrate anyone who does fan art, but it could be fun. But if it's all you're doing, unless that's really what you want, there's only so much time in the day, there's only so much time in a lifetime in terms of how many illustration pieces or comics you can make. So this piece is obviously, as the title suggests, a portrait style illustration of the primary cast members, Sandra and Jodie from the TV show Killing Eve. And when I was putting this together, I was really thinking about mostly working in the style of like a Bob Peak kind of movie poster. Like, I really wanted to have that kind of style of sort of a montage of images laid on top of one another. Bob Peak, also, what's his name? Robert E. McGinnis was someone I was thinking about, another poster artist who worked primarily in the 60s and 70s, who did a lot of posters for James Bond. So Killing Eve, if you've never seen the show before, follows Sandra Oh's character, who's a American expat living in England and working for MI6. So it's a kind of an espionage theme. She's tracking down a female assassin known as Villanelle, who we see here. And So based on that MI6 connection and the espionage theme, it was hard not to think about James Bond. The showrunner from the first season of the show, I don't know why I'm blanking on her name right now. I'm trying to do too many things at once. She apparently did rewrites on the most recent James Bond movie, which has been delayed due to pandemic. And so it's not totally superfluous, the James Bond connection that I'm talking about here. But I was basically taking that as the inspiration for putting this piece together. So in thinking about that, and knowing that, of course, this is an ink drawing demo I'm putting together, one of the elements I was playing with was the idea of positive and negative shapes. The way that Sandra Oh's hair is kind of a recurring motif in the show, like her kind of bushy, curly mane, and it's sort of a fixation point for the assassin character she's chasing down. And so I thought I could utilize that as sort of a backdrop for the full figure Villanelle portrait in the foreground, and really let like the sort of relatively white shapes in this portrait pop out against a black background. So Sandra Oh, white background, black hair becomes the black hair in the foreground or middle ground becomes the black background upon which the Villanelle character is popping out. So this is something obviously that ink drawing is really good at, is creating this kind of contrast. So I try to take advantage of that whenever I can. In my professional illustration work, I generally, after the ink drawing is done, will color this digitally. And so one of the first things I usually do is color all this black ink, give it a colored line look, because I found that that will activate sort of the colors in the interior of these drawings a little bit. So it's kind of ironic that personally, as someone whose primary interest is in comics, I'm so attached to these tools, but in some sense the finished product doesn't really look as much as this what we call production art, or essentially artwork that no one is going to see in this version. This blue white background, no one's going to see this work essentially until it's being reproduced. So that is also where the blue pencil comes in. Sort of an old holdover from older print technology that actually wouldn't be able to pick up such a light blue color. And so you could kind of rest assured that that you could kind of mark up the page quite a bit before you go out into the sort of ink finish, and none of this stuff would come up in the reproduction. So that's why if you look at original comic art, more often than not, you'll see some kind of blue marks underneath the black ink drawing. So because I'm filling in this background detail, or sorry, this background with ink, it gives me a lot of leeway in terms of the thickness of line that I'm using on this outline. But under normal circumstances, I'd really want to pay attention to the way that I could use the line weight moving around the form as a way to describe the form a little bit. I hope that's showing up. Anyway. And if you're watching, please feel free to drop in a comment, ask a question, anything that pops into your head would be much appreciated, so that you can kind of guide this monologue a little bit. Okay, so did not want to hit that corner quite like that. Don't think it affected the line too much, but so what else can I tell you? So I'm using Speedball, Super Black India ink. I don't totally have a preference about the ink I use, except just over the years I found that at some point I bought Speedball and used it and it worked fine enough, and I've stuck with it ever since. I guess I don't know if there are any particular brands of ink I would dissuade anyone from. And I think a lot of this stuff with art supplies is really a matter of preference. Unfortunately, you could spend a lot of time reading supply lists from some of your favorite cartoonists or illustrators, fine artists, and hoping that you'll find the exact right material that will make your work look exactly like theirs. And the truth is that is impossible. And everyone has different kind of preferences in terms of work surface. I'm working on Bristol. I think this is vellum finish as opposed to smooth finish. I like that extra little tooth, which is really all that denotes. Tools. I'm using a size 3, pretty cheap Winsor & Newton Cotman round point brush. And in my personal experience, I've found that size 2 or 3 are kind of the best option when you're working at the scale that I usually work at with these illustrations, which is no larger than 11 inches by 17 inches. Size 3 or size 2 brushes work well because they can give you a pretty wide range of line weight in terms of, really thin, sort of small mark, like some of the little details I've been doing in the interior of this Villanelle figure, and a much thicker mark. So I usually don't even use any brushes certainly smaller than this, but not really larger than this as well. It's sort of rare that I'll do that. And it's one of the things I like about working this way. With ink, non-photo blue pencil, Bristol. So it's cheap and it's simple. It's relatively few tools. It's still grounded in traditional media, which I like. I think that's always a good way to start. I like to do my preliminary sketches for any illustration. I like to do those in pencil. I like to do as much of the art traditionally as I can, but I'm unfortunately not a tremendous painter, and to be honest, painting takes a tremendous amount of time, and with a lot of my work, I'm on a relatively tight deadline for editorial illustration, for example, and I'm not about to sit down and sort of fill in all these shapes with gouache. Anyway, so I like to do digital coloring is the point of that tangent. So in putting this image together, my thinking about it was pretty simple. I actually didn't do any preliminary sketches because, the stakes are pretty low. Just a simple demo piece for class, and really my requirements for what I'm trying to show. The main thing is that I want something in the foreground and something in the background, and something is a relatively large form and something that's smaller, so I can kind of demonstrate to the students that broad range of line weight that I'm talking about. And so once I decided, rather arbitrarily, because I was watching season 2 of Killing Eve once I decided to do portraits of these characters, the composition sort of fell in place pretty easily from there. I think Sandra Oh has a really interesting profile, so I thought that would be fun to capture. So I arranged the image that way. And, you know, just for contrast, of course, if you have one giant head and profile, why not do the other character as a full figure, smaller scale. Pretty much direct, dead on from the front, a little bit of a 3/4 view with the face. And then I went about compiling reference photos to use for this. So essentially it was a lot of Googling. It's as simple as that. That's the way most illustrators these days ultimately get a lot of their reference photos. I think it's good whenever you can to take your own reference photos whenever you have the chance, you know, if you're trying to get a certain pose, or if there's any kind of object that you have easy access to in the house. I think it's good to stage those photos. Often I'll use myself for a model, put the timer on my iPhone, even just prop it up, use a simple, cheap tripod, and take some photos of myself with, you know, it might even use, you know, for the gun in this illustration, kind of a stand-in object, something similar in size and shape, so that I can get, you know, for example, lighting information, seeing the way shadows. Oh, I do have a viewer. I've been sitting here staring at my computer like no one's here. Hi Hiba. Is it Hiba or Hiba? How do you decide where you make the line thicker or thinner? Is it about the direction of light or about a sort of flow or something else? So the way that I usually think about the line weight in a piece, there's roughly 3 things that I take into consideration, especially in my cartooning work, where so much of the composition and the way an image is drawn is for the sake of communication, trying to get a story to come across, but also in illustration, because similar concerns. I think about what information is important, like which objects or elements in the composition really need kind of like a punch or a highlight. And those images I might give kind of a thicker line weight. The other thing I think about in terms of more of a sense of realism, anything in the foreground, I give a thicker line weight just because, you know, kind of realistically it makes sense that something's going to be larger the closer it gets to you. And of course people don't have actual outlines on their body, so it's kind of, in a sense, abstract to think of things this way, that the outline's gonna get bigger like anything else, but that's usually one way I'll do it. Think about thicker lines foreground, thinner lines background, and then also I think about the lighting. So that really is a huge part of it, is the direction of the light. And that's interesting because I've actually heard, I think depending on the effect you're trying to create, you could do kind of the inverse of what I usually do in terms of organizing the line weight to convey a sense of light and shadow. I usually give a thicker outline to sections of the form that are kind of receding out of the light, and thinner closer to the light. But I think to some extent you can do the inverse, where if you really want to make you know, a highlight feel like it has punch, I think putting a dark outline might create that, but you know, that's generally not the way I work. So to your second question, about the light looking coherent for the whole piece, that's really the trick of mixing reference images, like I tried to do. And this kind of gets to the point I was talking about earlier. So compiling reference photos for a piece like this, usually if I'm doing portraits of, famous figures, you're kind of balancing a couple things. One is that you need the likeness to read. So it needs to look as much like the figure as possible, that someone can understand who it is these figures are supposed to be without any kind of text letting them know. But the other thing is a lot of clients can't afford to buy the rights to, like photos and give them to you to use. So you don't want to copy any one photograph directly. And even if you do, if you just try to stick to one photograph and copy exactly the way that photo looks, as opposed to just thinking generally about what is recognizable and interesting or sort of iconic about that figure, the image usually looks pretty stiff. So what I try to do is get as many different photos as possible for each kind of element of the portrait. So I had kind of a folder on my computer of Sandra Oh images and Jodie images that I was working from. And with Sandra Oh, it was really just a few photographs. I was like maybe 3 or 4 that I was looking at. I had 2 or 3 different photos of her from like close-up shots from the show. So I could see the way she's styled in the show. And just get that portrait really clearly in profile. I also got I keep bumping that. I got at least one photograph of Sandra Oh from the front, just so I can get a better sense of what I'm looking at, like 3-dimensionally, because I think sometimes that can inform how you draw a portrait, even if it is, obviously from one point of view. And then the other thing I was looking at a lot was her hair. I had a number of photos where, it didn't really matter what the angle of the photograph was looking at her, but really just trying to get a sense of the texture of her hair and the way it flows, and just getting that information. So kind of compiling all those things together. And that, getting to your point, your question, that's really kind of the tricky thing, is figuring out how to compile all those images or draw them, render them with a convincing sense that, you aren't just mixing and matching things, but that they're actually all in the same situation. And a huge part of that is lighting. And so usually what I do is all, in the example of something like this, I'll have one photograph that I'm really looking to in terms of like the lighting information. So there was one scene in, I think, season 1 of the show where there's a confrontation in the kitchen, and there's a very particular lighting setup. And so I was kind of looking at that primarily for the Sandra Oh image. I kind of toned down some of the shadow a little bit, but mainly it's just the idea of like the shadow, the light coming primarily from to the right, Sandra Oh's right in this sort of composition, and from above. So you have a shadow coming down along her neck. But in terms of this whole scene, I mentioned earlier that I was kind of inspired thinking about, the MI6 connection in the plot of Killing Eve to James Bond. And so that was kind of my main thought in terms of arranging this composition as anything other than just like simple portraits was to kind of think about those James Bond posters, because I feel like that's such a like those iconic Richard McGinnis I have the book. I have a book of his art above my drawing table, so I'm looking for the name. But that kind of like poster artwork, I feel like, is so iconic and a part of what we think about, in pop culture with espionage and that kind of genre of like spy fiction, which Killing Eve plays with in a really interesting way, I think. So, it's a very simple thing, very subtle, or, I don't want to say subtle, that's maybe giving me too much credit, but very small sort of choice that I made in terms of just, arranging these two images on top of each other in a way that isn't obviously realistic. It's more of kind of a montage or, a collage effect of combining these two perspectives. But that was sort of my thinking there. And the Jodie Comer portrait, you might be able to tell looking at it by how dark this non-photo blue pencil is on that figure. I spent a lot of time drawing and redrawing it, and it gave me a ton of trouble. And a huge part of that, again, getting back to the issue of photo reference, is that I didn't have a single great photo that I was going off of for the Jodie Comer or Villanelle character drawing. And the main issue is just like getting the pose, because her portrait's relatively small in this drawing, and that's almost, when you're working at such a small scale, it's almost more like caricature. Like you're really looking at just the general shapes of the face and trying to translate those. Excuse me. With the pose, there was something, I had a really particular image in mind, and I kind of started by just drawing that kind of freehand from my imagination, like the pose that I wanted based on, the kind of James Bond poster I was picturing in my head. And then when I was looking at actual photos, trying to get good screen grabs and promotional photography of Jodie Comer as this character, and especially since there was a particular outfit I was looking for, it became really hard to kind of retrofit all of those different photographs into the same pose that I kind of had just made up. And so, I didn't want to take any of my own photos for this because it's kind of a quick piece, just a little bit of fan art, and ultimately I ended up probably spending more time because I just kept erasing and drawing and redrawing and sort of nudging shapes and lines and trying to get the pose to work the way I wanted it to. So all this is really just to say that I think it's always worth taking your own reference photos, even when you're working on something like this where you're relying on a lot of reference material that isn't your own, by necessity. I think with something like a pose, especially if you don't have, a kind of really intuitive grasp of the figure and anatomy, it's worth having, at least one really good reference photo to use for the pose itself. And then you can kind of, mix and match some of these other elements like the costuming details. Those are relatively easy to kind of fit to things, I find. The kind of imaginative work of combining things. I find that to be relatively easy as long as like the underlying structure of the drawing is there, which is the hardest part. So next time I would definitely just save myself the time and actually take a photo even of myself, even just doing this pose. And I could kind of retrofit the feminine figure to my unappealing body. So anyway, I hope this doesn't look totally uninteresting at this small size. Now we're getting into the kind of the nitty-gritty of the little details in this portrait. I just realized I didn't finish doing these eyelashes on Sandra Oh, so I'm gonna just drop those in there really quick. And stuff like eyelashes and hair is actually pretty fun to do, because one of the advantages of working with like traditional ink media with like a brush is that you can get a much different kind of line quality out of the brush than you would if you were just using a stiff pen. And so here I'm just trying to kind of like flick the eyelashes a little bit and try to capture those lines in, you know, as unfussed over and as spontaneous a mark as I can. You know, and sometimes this, you know, mileage may vary depending on how tired you are when you're working, or how hot it might be in your studio because you turned off, oh, I don't know, you turned off the air conditioning so that the sound quality in a video wouldn't be too horrible. These kind of little things can kind of impact how well the line comes across, but the hope is that it's looks a little bit more spontaneous and lively. So when I'm doing these individual strands of hair for Sandra Oh here, and honestly, even when you're doing the kind of thicker sections of hair, I still try to almost act as though I'm, you know, rather than outlining the shape and kind of just filling it in, I try to think about it more like I'm drawing each strand of hair, if that makes sense. So that way the shape of the hair is a little bit more, oof, I don't like that. It's a little bit more spontaneous and feels a little, you know, less like a kind of a helmet sitting on their head, but something that really is made up of a number of strands of hair. If you're just joining us, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Just drop in a line in the chat. I'd appreciate the help sort of in guiding my internal monologue as I'm working on this piece. And thank you, Heba, for... I can't be pronouncing your name right. Haiba. Thank you, Haiba. Maybe I should take the time to Google it even. That'll be a compelling watch, I think. Get a phonetic spelling. Thank you for your question. I appreciate it. Oh. So one of the more satisfying things to do when you're working on an ink drawing is just fill in these big sections of black. But it's you kind of want to save it till the end for the most part, because well, for one, it's like dessert. Just a nice, satisfying way to finish things up, but also sometimes I'll get carried away and put some ink on the left side of the page, and then on the right side of the page, and then immediately move to the left and kind of swipe my hand around Heba. So it was right. Okay, great. Happy I got it right the first time. But then I undermine it by saying it the wrong way a dozen other times out of second guessing myself. Sorry about that. What was I saying? Oh yeah. So yeah, sometimes I'll wipe my my hand across the page, ruin the drawing, smear some ink, which is the last thing you want. So usually these big sections of black I try to save to the end, unless I'm really just trying to figure out how to balance let's say the smaller details sometimes, like when I'm looking at personally my own feeling about ink drawings, or the kind of the look that I'm going for when I finish with these illustrations, is that I want things to be relatively simple. Personally, in terms of like as a draftsman, I kind of spend a lot of time overworking some of these drawings. Again, getting back to the issues I had with this figure, and kind of the discipline of ink drawing, which is what really appeals to me about it, is kind of editing down and kind of reducing information a little bit, kind of taking out some of the lines and details that I penciled in, and kind of like forcing myself to ignore them and only focus on the details that are really important to conveying a sense of the form. So there's kind of like some extra wrinkles on Sandra Oh's face that I kind of marked in here that I'm just going to leave incomplete. So sometimes when I'm doing a figure like this Jodie Comer piece, where there are kind of spot blacks, like shadows that I really want to pop out, I'll want to kind of block in some of those, what we call spot blacks, those big areas of ink, as I'm going, more than I would normally, because I want to get a sense of what the piece looks like in terms of that balance of black and white, seeing if, maybe once I have kind of black around these arms, for example, I might not want to put as many wrinkles in the fabric. Maybe I want that pristine white to come across. And usually when I'm trying to decide on like those kinds of details, I always defer to the ones that give a sense of like the structure of what it is we're looking at. Like, having a shadow on the knee makes sense, because there's a moment of tension under the fabric there that you want to capture, because it suggests the form. But maybe a detail like, I don't know, some of these like these angled lines kind of falling off of her jacket, kind of falling off of her. I might want to kind of ease off those a little bit, because it's not quite as important. Likewise, I put a lot of details in this gun relative to other parts of the figure, and so that might be something that later, if I'm cleaning things up with gouache or editing it digitally, I might get rid of some of those. But I think for now, I like the way it looks. Oh my gosh. So Heba, what brings you here today? How'd you land on this video? Gotta stop bumping that. So you guys can't see this. I guess I could nudge this. No, I'm gonna leave it. I'm actually working at an angle right now. I have a portable straight edge drawing board that I like to use, and that's mostly to save my Instagram story. So do you follow me? Are you a follower? Do I not? Should I be aware of you? I'm curious if that I used the Killing Eve hashtag, and I'm curious if that worked. If that worked at all. If that brought anyone in. Anyway, I'm working at an angle, mostly to save my back, but when you work in something like, when I do my watercolor work, the angle becomes much more important in terms of controlling the way that the bead flows. With ink, another benefit of... Oh, nice. Well, thank you for your follow. Thanks for also following the link and joining this chat. Kind of a new endeavor for me. I lost my train of thought. I was talking about beads, I think. Beads of water, beads of ink, beads of paint. Ink dries relatively quickly as compared to, when you're working in watercolor. But one of the benefits is that, and maybe you can see this with the shine on the page a little bit, is that the ink does dry a little bit more slowly than if you were working with a pen, for example. So it kind of allows you to manipulate that bead of ink across the page a little bit as you're working. To kind of go back over things. Go away. Wow, I'm really... Sometimes you trip over your words. So Heba, are you an artist? What is your background? Now this detail is really... I wish I did this closer to when I actually drew it so I can remember what is supposed to be going on with this collar. And normally when I'm inking these things, I'd have my photo reference still open on my computer, even though my pencils are relatively tight, so that I don't have to I want to plan things out as best I can so I can be relatively loose and in the moment with the inks, but but even still, it's good sometimes with little kind of confusing details like this curly collar. You know, I might want to be able to look at the photographs and understand what I'm drawing here. I think that turned out okay though. I like the quality that has. You're supposed to study math, but I do a lot more art than math. Well, I don't blame you. That's math was never my strong suit, so that's certainly not. I can't imagine. Couldn't imagine motivating to do that. At what level are you studying math? Are you in college? Are you in high school? Grad student? Middle school? Just taught middle school recently for the first time. So I'm not gonna rule that out. But I think if you were one of my middle school students, I would have remembered your name. And your questions are too incisive to be a middle school student, I'll tell you that much. So I can only assume you're an adult. Master's degree. Nice. Okay. Yeah, that's very different from middle school. Starting. So this is your year in your first year. My girlfriend just finished getting her master's in art. So I'm sure it's a very different thing. So when you say you do a lot of art, that's distracting you from your math studies. Is that kind of just as a hobby? Did you do art in undergrad? Are you taking classes? So when I'm doing even these sections of kind of larger shadows that aren't necessarily lines, you know, when these kind of line details start to thicken out, I still try to capture those with as relatively few brush strokes. I try to minimize the number of times I'm kind of going over the same shape. Try to use the thickness of the brush as a way to kind of get those in there and give them a kind of more organic shape than they might have otherwise, you know. Might hit that over later. And so one of the things that I do that I've kind of refrained from this whole time, but that actually, this one little screw up is I'm not gonna stand for that. When I'm working on these ink drawings, if I mess up or if there's something that, you know, I don't quite like the way it turned out, I go back in with a orange pencil to kind of just mark for myself areas that I might want to touch back up later with whiteout or white gouache to kind of clean things up. And the reason why I do that is because I'm kind of if we're being generous, we'll call it a perfectionist mindset, but really it's just I'm very anal. if I don't have a plan when I'm going in, if I decide to make corrections on an ink drawing, and I just go in with white gouache without these kind of marks to guide me and to kind of show me places that I really want to change, then I will just sit here with my whiteout and just touch up every little line and mark and shape for hours and hours, and no one wants that. Because on the one hand, it's a huge waste of time. On the other hand, it'll kind of ultimately ruin the drawing, I've found. Like, when I really spend a lot of time kind of manipulating these things, it kind of kills that lively quality, which is really the whole advantage of doing ink drawing with a brush in the first place. You know, you want things to feel kind of more spontaneous than that. And you can kind of deaden that line quality if you just are manipulating it too much, which, you know, again, is the reason why I'm not trying not to go over these lines too much, because they kind of have the same impact. And you're not an illustrator. Oh, the cameo from my cat, Toast. Are you trying to make a mess? She stepped right in the ink. I'll be paying for that later when I find ink on the couch. What was I saying? Oh yes, you're not a true artist until you put a brush in your mouth, until you hold, you know, you gotta, I feel like that's the real like sign of an impassioned artist, is you absentmindedly hold things in your mouth. Which if you ever see the Robert Altman movie Vincent, I think it's Vincent, or is it Van Gogh? I'm pretty sure it's Vincent, with Timothy Roth as Vincent van Gogh. There's all these great scenes of Van Gogh painting and almost like eating paint, like he keeps licking the not the handle end, but the brush tip of his brushes, which I love. I like the way you show texture with simple shapes, and I don't know how to answer your question because I don't know how serious I am about art. Well, that's fair. That's fair. Thank you. I try to get that texture in there. You know, I think it's kind of something always working on. It's kind of the discipline, really, is just trying to figure that stuff out. So when I originally started doing ink drawing, I just remember it being really mind-blowing and challenging at first to have to use a brush, because it is like you ultimately have more control than you would with a pen, but it really means, like, you know, any kind of shake of the hand, it's not very forgiving, essentially. And before that, when I was a teenager or younger, before I started using a brush and, you know, India ink, the way I would try to get these different line thicknesses is simply by actually going over the same line with a pen, you know, over and over again, trying to build it up from, you know, I had like these, you know, microns, and I would use kind of different size microns, but, you know, if I wanted to get a really, really thick outline, like some of these contours along the edge of Sandra Oh's face, I would do things like that. And it was really because I was looking at a lot of comic work by people like Craig Thompson. He's a big adolescent hero of mine, and he uses a lot, like, he has like really expressionistic brushwork, but, you know, even stuff that was a little bit less so, a little bit tighter in terms of the inks, like in superhero comics. I don't think I totally understood that they were using a brush or a dip pen for those things, and so I didn't know how that line thickness was achieved. So I would just kind of go over and over and over the same line, and it would make things look really, really dead. And so when I started using a brush, I remember feeling like really excited about the way that you could use the line quality in terms of the way you lay down a brush stroke to get some of that difference in texture and the difference in thickness and line weight, and didn't look dead. So now my cat is literally just sitting behind my drawing table and behind my mic and watching me. So that's at least one other one other viewer I have here. Okay, so this part is going to be really tricky, getting Jodie Comer's face, because when you're working at a likeness of this size, if you screw up some of these lines, if they're just placed a little bit differently in the face, it might not look like the person. So this is going to be a little bit of a rocky road, bumpy road. Let's not say rocky road. That's going to make me want to get up and leave. I'm already sweating. Don't need to think about ice cream as well, and I don't know if I like the way this is turning out. So I don't know. See, this is kind of hard. I'm trying to figure out, I still want that kind of loose quality with the strands of hair on the Villanelle figure, but it's it's flipped. It's white on black. So I've never tried this before, so I don't know. Getting these more spontaneous looking strands of hair in the negative, it's a little confusing. So I might just have to touch that up with gouache, try to figure that out after I have this black shape blocked in and I can figure it out. So Heba, what kind of art do you do in terms of, have you tried your hand with ink drawing? Do you do digital art? Do you do painting? I'm personally partial to charcoal, but I haven't used it in so long because it's so messy. Maybe one day I'll have a larger studio and I could just have a dirty charcoal corner. But the last time I did a big charcoal drawing on commission, I got just charcoal dust floating all around the studio. Every single surface for like a month afterwards, I was finding charcoal dust on it. And I have all my expensive art books in here with me, and you know, I'm I feel like I've ruined them all by doing that. But anyway, if money and space was no object, well, maybe I'd like to get back into oil painting. I haven't done that since art school, but I would definitely be doing lots of charcoal drawings because I think those are fun. And I wonder if I'm gonna pick her up. I'm gonna pick her up so she doesn't. Toast, say hi. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Okay. I didn't want her to step on the keyboard again. Give her a little assist there. Crossing over. Yeah, see, I don't know. I think this is kind of what I was talking about. I feel like the cheek is a little off on this character. Oh, awesome. Book illustration. So is that commission work? What kind of books are you illustrating? Or is that like the style you're looking at? Because I gotta say, if these are commissioned book illustrations, then regardless of how serious you think you are about art, you're at least mildly serious about art. Someone's taking you seriously in regards to your art if they're paying you to do book illustrations or even hiring you. I should, having taught so many younger students, I should never assume that anyone's getting paid for their work. Certainly there's plenty of people who are eager for illustration work but aren't going to pay for it. And that's kind of a long learning process to figure out how to navigate that. Also, what kind of painting? Like, is it watercolor, acrylic, gouache, oil? Just listing all the paints. Unless you're doing tempera, which would be pretty crazy. Be very impressed. Oh man. So you can tell I'm kind of, and I've drifted over. Gotta reorient. You could tell I'm procrastinating on this face a little bit. It's the very last thing. Oh, it's gonna be so brutal. Okay. I should keep talking if you're doing an ink drawing and I'm just silent. That can't be that can't be compelling. If I'm your like tune out background noise entertainment for your ink drawing, that's a huge honor. I really appreciate that. Lately, I've been putting on this YouTube channel Cartoonist Kayfabe, Kayfabe, when I do my artwork, especially inks like this, because it's a little bit more mindless, or I don't want to say mindless. It's a different kind of thing. But I feel like I can listen to music or listen to a podcast or kind of have something on in the background when I'm doing this work. Anyway. Cartoonist kayfabe. That's what I listen to. It's professional cartoonists talking about a lot of masterful comics work, and then a lot of what we would call low culture. They go through old Wizard magazines, which was a huge part of my childhood. And it's amazing how much they know about a lot of comics that nowadays we would consider a lot of really hokey, just mainstream trash that hasn't aged very well. But they can analyze it in a way that is remarkably compelling, I find. I've had a few commissions, but most are for fun, books I like, and mostly acrylics and gouache. So you're doing like kind of, we'll say on spec, like illustration for existing books that you enjoy. Is that my interpretation? I thought for a long time about doing a series of, well, it started out I wanted to do a graphic novel adaptation of The Island of Dr. Moreau, because that's a classic H.G. Wells book I'm a huge fan of. And it's in the public domain, so I've been thinking about doing something like that, but it's, doing an undertaking like a full-length graphic novel, especially if you're kind of adapting someone else's work, and there's a certain level of pressure there in terms of research. It's a huge undertaking, so I haven't jumped into that, but it's something I think about a lot. And then recently I've been thinking more about just doing it as a series of illustrations in my downtime. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, which you may or may not have been here for, there's only so much time. And there's only so many illustrations one has in them, so many comics one has in them. This is, I guess as I get closer to 30, this is the way I think now. I don't know how old you are. Certainly you can't be too young if you're going for your master's degree, but I don't know. I feel like I only talk to people who are younger than me these days. That can't be true. I teach an adult class. That's absolutely untrue. I don't know where that's coming from. Went from middle school in the spring to adults age 18 to, I'm sure, 50 or 60 in the summer. That's where I'm at. And see, this is the fun part. I just get to go over this shape, fill that in. So I really don't, as predicted, do not like the way Jodie Comer's little face turned out there. So that's something I'm going to go over later. And I don't know. I'm going to put a line there even though it's not going to be hard for me to remember. I don't know if that even shows up on camera now that I'm thinking about it. Those little orange X's. I don't think it'll be hard for me to remember that I want to fix that face up, but I'm gonna mark it anyway. Such is my habit. Okay, wow. And then basically that's a finished illustration for the most part for this stage. I don't know if I'll color this one. Maybe I will. Maybe that'll be another demo. Do a screen capture. Do some flat coloring in Photoshop. What else can I show you? Here, Heba, have you ever used an architect's ruling pen? Have you seen these before? It's pretty nifty. So this is a drafting pen or a ruling pen. I've seen it listed both ways on online. But this is essentially when you look at a traditionally drawn comic book, like a newspaper comic strip or old superhero comics, you may notice that, the panels are drawn with a straight edge. And if you know that everything's being done with traditional media, you might ask yourself how that was done. And you might think that it's as simple as using a ruler and where's my okay, using a ruler, and I gotta stop doing that, using a ruler and artist pen, just dragging it across, and it is you could do it that way, but the way that actually a lot of those comic book panels are done, if you look carefully at them, sometimes you can notice the edge has a certain quality to it. That's because it's done with these nifty ruling pen tools, which I think are pretty interesting. The way that this works, so if you just look at it, it's two pieces of metal screwed together, and you can adjust by turning this how close together or far apart these are spread. And essentially what that's doing is changing the weight of your line. And the way that this works is that you dip it in ink, and looking at this, you can see that the bead of, because of surface tension, the bead of ink kind of sits kind of perfectly in between. It's stuck in between the two pieces of metal. So this is the way that you can get straight edge lines with traditional India ink. So I'm gonna get my ruler. Got a cork backing. Of course, that's pretty important in terms of pulling this off. If you have ruler just sitting flat, absolutely on the page, if you do this, you'll get ink underneath it, so that's kind of tricky. So you need cork backed ruler, and you just put it up next to the line. And let me make sure that I'm on camera here. And then you just put it up against it. And drag it down. So this piece doesn't really need borders like this, but I might as well do it anyway, since I'm here. Just to give you guys a sense of how to do this. And this is another part that I find kind of fun, in that it's sort of tedious, busy work, which I think personally it's good to build some stuff like this into your artistic process, because sometimes you need to work I don't know. I find that these are a blessing because sometimes you have work to do, but don't necessarily feel up to the task of the more thoughtful or labor-intensive work. So just kind of busy, dumb stuff like this is pretty fun for me. So I savor this stuff like I savor, flatting blacks, like I mentioned before, filling those in. Just filling in the black shapes with ink. It's another similar task. I used to think lettering was a task along these lines, writing the text in my comics, but actually, if you're not thinking about what you're doing when you're lettering something, it's easy to, for example, accidentally write the lyrics of a song you're listening to instead of your comics dialogue, and or misspell something or skip a letter, and that kind of stuff is a nightmare. So don't letter comics as busy work. Star Shader. Star Shader, who are you? Welcome. I feel like I've seen your username before. That's the only reason why I ask. So I don't know if you're one of my students or an acquaintance of some sort, but welcome nonetheless. You're here just in time. As I am literally finishing up the ink stage of this illustration. Wow, there it is. I mean, theoretically, I could... Oh, you found me through Art Prof. That tracks. Well, thanks for showing up. This is unfortunately the end of the video. I'm going to cut it off here. I could theoretically sit here and get out my white gouache and start to fix up some of these shapes. But personally, this is my other little bit of art wisdom. When I'm working in stages like this, one of the appealing things for me about doing an ink drawing like this is that you kind of work in stages, from thumbnail sketch to pencil underdrawing to, the finished ink drawing on top, and then kind of fixing things up with gouache. Part of the nice thing about doing things in stages like this is it gives you these built-in opportunities to take a break and set things aside, and then when you come back to it, you're a little bit more fresh-eyed and you can kind of be more analytical, a little bit more objective about it. So personally, I try to step away from an ink drawing before I go back and tidy it up or fix it, because I want to be able to make sure that I'm not being overly critical of my work, that, because sometimes these lines will look really ugly to me, but then the next day I'll look at them and be like, actually, I love the way that this kind of dry brush texture breaks up, or, some of these wonkier kind of line textures might be appealing. So I usually take a break, take 24 hours off, and then come back to it and clean things up like that. Unless, of course, you're on a tight deadline, you can't do that. But in an ideal situation, you try to budget your time accordingly. Anyway, so I am going to cut it off here. This is my long-winded way of saying that. You really enjoyed the traveling and quick sketches that y'all did. Thank you. The travel sketches are a blast. So is this the finish? No, yeah, so this is the finished version of this illustration in terms of the inks. The next step for me with these illustrations is that I will usually hit them with white gouache. I know lots of cartoonists use whiteout. Recently even heard of a pretty famous cartoonist, I think it might have been Alex Toth, who uses, he's dead, he used white acrylic. Don't quote me on that, but yeah, that's usually the next stage for me, and then I'll scan it in and color everything digitally in Photoshop. So I might follow up with another video in the future when I'm cleaning this up, and you guys can kind of check in with me in stages and see how this gets finished up. But for now, this is kind of the stage that I leave it at. Bye, Heba. Thanks for tuning in and chatting with me, keeping me company. Anyone else who tuned in, thanks also for watching. And I hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope you got something interesting about it, or interesting out of it. And yeah, happy drawing. That has been a ink drawing demo. All right.